Scott Pilgrim, a several hundreds long series of .jpegs that I was, up until recently, blissfully unaware of. And apparently also, supposedly, the cartoon character that fought the world and got the girl and won. Or so the title claims, at least. And perhaps it was even once true, but in the end, Scott was fighting the wrong enemy, as it was not the world or the 7 evil exes that defeated him, but rather his own creator, as the still technically titular main character finds himself killed off in the very first episode of his new Netflix animated series, and replaced by his girlfriend. A turn of event I would like to call shocking, but in the age of bait and switches in which we now reside, it is about as avant-garde as putting butter on bread. Yeah, just for my own amusement, primarily, let me spell out precisely how bold and brand new this idea is. The recently released Napoleon movie was about Josephine, more so than it was about the military career of one of the world's greatest strategists. The He-Man series threw him off the cliff in episode 1 and replaced him with a chick. The Wheel of Time is about Moraine now, and not the mother-humping dragon reborn, who's barely even visible on the poster. Thor, the god of thunder, is subdued by a lady using a taser on him and comes along to watch Thor fail to protect Asgard. And eventually the lady becomes the king of Asgard. In the series about Obi-Wan Kenobi's time on Tatooine protecting Luke, we see him protecting baby Leia, and Luke is briefly introduced in the last episode for a moment or two. Even in the Terminator universe, where John Connor is a pretty important character, he's casually killed off in Dark Fate and replaced with a woman. At this particular point in history, Colombian necktying your main character is about as risque as a full-body bubble wrap. But anywho, let's buckle up and follow in the same 15 meters deep pre-trod footsteps that Brian Lee O'Malley, the creator, did to discover why arsenicking Scott was an unavoidable consequence of one of the things that made him popular in the first place: Scott Pilgrim's, at the time, quite unusual progressivism. But first, a slight little sidetrack here, because to really explain all of this, we need to visit the wonderful world of early 2000s webcomics. I know, it's a deviation, but it makes sense. And I already have a sneaking little inkling that a goodly portion of you children out there haven't the faintest idea what a web or a comic is, much less the two combined. But back in the early Bronze Age, known as the 2000s, webcomics were hot shit. And just like the little gremlins of today look up at their monitors and say, "I want to be a Minecraft YouTuber when I grow up," the kids back then idolized webcomics and their creators. They were a genuinely massive cultural phenomenon at the time, despite the usually rather simple premises. Webcomics could largely, and exceptionally crudely, be divided into 2 camps. The first mostly talked about games or geek shit in a funny fashion by saying, "Hey, wouldn't it be silly if game logic happened in the real world?" And yes it would. The joke actually stayed relatively funny for literally years. And by my long dead fucking goldfish, it is weird going back and seeing this stuff now. A time of nerddom completely untouched by culture wars, where the most vicious and divisive conflict. So which console you preferred? Better times. But not wholly unfamiliar, mind you, as the second type of comic posed the highly philosophical question: wouldn't you like to piston pound some furries into submission? Like I said, not wholly unfamiliar. This too, by the way, is where the suspiciously rich furries joke comes from, as a lot of webcomics at the time had a very big problem with monetization, a problem growing larger as the medium became more and more popular and more webcomics emerged. They didn't have the full infrastructure that we have today, and the solution to this quandary was to find the fetish with the wealthiest patrons and tickle their pickles till the green flowed forth. Tragically, both of these forms of entertainment would largely find themselves eradicated by ever-increasingly fierce competition. In the traditional story-based webcomic scene, the fresh crop came from people who had thought, wow, I want to draw webcomics for a living, but had also possessed the wherewithal to go, wait, maybe I should learn how to draw first. And so went to art school. And so in a market where this was considered not merely acceptable, but cream of the crop art, well, it was hit like a dino-busting space rock by webcomics that looked like this. Yeah. And as for the fur fluffers, displaying a canine-class sharpness of intellect, they realized that rather than reading through 200 pages of dialogue for a nip-slip at the end, they could just pay people to produce kitten-crushing hardcore R18 porn instead. And yes, I do see the irony considering recent thumbnails, but moving on towards Scott Pilgrim yet again, as this is supposedly a video about him after all. It came out at just the perfect time. 2004 was still in the slot where the story of every single webcomic, which is why I brought them up, was still popular, as Scott Pilgrim is in essence just a 2000s webcomic. See, Scott is a classic self-insert male character with just above freezing IQ, and a license to cause cringe, but not too much, just so much that the reader can look at him and think, I'm a lot better than this guy. And then our MC runs into a hot girl, and better still, a saucy senorita who, as inexplicably as it is apparently predictable, finds the MC's brand of patented retardation just so damn cute. Then follows a lengthy period of absurd happenstances, briefly interrupted by moments of lol so random, before the beauty and the plank kiss and or pound. The comic also had the advantage of an at-the-time novel-ish art style and a near preternatural ability to channel the then very fresh and now sand-drenched mummy vagina hipster style. It also had a story that, besides the more obvious preceding points, apparently really spoke to that generation. Now, I must admit, I found both comics, movie, and anime to be just one of the most singularly pointless things I have ever seen. I would quite genuinely describe the anime in particular, or Western animation, what you want to call it, as little more than a disjointed series of aimless pictures and noises, assaulting me continuously, about as structured and engaging as a pig-pen brawl between 3 3/4 fat, long, retired luchadores. But I also strongly suspect that this has more to do with me, and the fact that the target demographic of Scott Pilgrim is prepubescent children suffering from severe cranial trauma. Okay, a bit harsh perhaps, but I've always been a massive entertainment elitist. Baby Arch was watching Fantasia and staring with rapt attention at the hill-sized devil in Night on Bald Mountain, so I probably could not possibly be further from the target audience of Scott Pilgrim. Even more so today, as another fascinating little thing is that Scott Pilgrim was, as I mentioned at the start, quite progressive for the time. It's hard to believe now, but once upon a time long, long ago, progressivism was actually edgy in its own way, and new and interesting. Of course, the progressivism of 2004 bears not a speck of resemblance to today's progressivism. In 2004, it was a big deal to have a girl with brightly colored hair, or a gay character in a visibly gay relationship. Ooh, that was quite spicy at the time. Certainly not unheard of, but unusual. Or to have the aforementioned girl be the one with the superpowers. And then you added in a bunch of gaming references a la the webcomics, as again, it is little more than a 2000 webcomics in a more traditional format. And also, it was quite the twist to have Scott be a far from perfect character. See, a lot of the preceding webcomics suffered in large degrees from having author self-inserts, which meant that the characters could be goofy and dumb, but not necessarily openly flawed. Now that did happen as well, but in general. And Scott, he was in fact quite observably so, a dickhole, well above pretty much any comparison. A lovable dickhole, but a dickhole nevertheless. Now again, I would argue that the point has been quite overstated. I've even in my research of this seen people refer to Scott as the villain of the show, which really makes me think these people didn't read much in their formative years. If this is their idea of a villain. Listen. Baby Arch read illustrated Bible stories as a kid, and he was praised by the teachers for being so interested in Christianity from a young age. Very healthy for a boy. Praiseworthy back then. Whilst what little Arch really wanted to see was the incredibly violent and bloody histories in the illustrated Bible stories. In those Old Testament books, there was slaughter, armies massacred, David braining Goliath, constant conflict, the murder of firstborn children, and rivers of blood. Hell, there was even one case of a king getting a hard-on for a married woman and sending her husband to die at the front line at the endless wars, so that the king could plow his wife. Now that is a villain. And yet Scott Pilgrim, in the words of his creator, needed to die because the way the online works has changed. Now, letting the readers figuring out things for themselves is apparently problematic, and I can agree, having looked at the current world myself. And if you do not explicitly condemn something, then that means that you condone and encourage it. Thus, Scott Pilgrim had to die. An early pioneer of the era of woke was not woke enough for it anymore. A brilliant example of the never-ending Ouroboros of progressive eat progressives, the world in which we now live. Scott was taken out in the show in episode 1, and the brown character and the woman given front seat. In another 20 years, that will not be progressive enough either. But to further burrow down on this part a little bit, because it is very telling of how far the purity spiral has come. What was Scott's greatest crime? What made him such a villain to the point where he would be dangerous to feature today? He was dating Knives Chow. She was 17, he was 23. And on the grand scale of evil, from dating a barely legal girl to, I don't know, genociding people? That's not really all that bad. It's not particularly evil at all. A 6 years age gap is hardly unheard of, and Knives, again, was plenty legal at the time. One could certainly argue that she was mentally immature, and thus Scott shouldn't have entered into a relationship with her, but Scott was plenty immature too. And, well, this is incidentally why the age of consent should be 30. And I'm only half joking when I say that, looking at today's young people. But Scott's greatest crime of all was cheating on her with Ramona Flowers, the girl. And this tends to be the thing that makes people say he was a villain the most. And I don't agree. Sure, cheating on people is not exactly the definition of gentlemanly behavior, but like a goddamn Disney love interest, Scott falls head over heels, obsessively in love with Ramona at first sight, literally, to the point where the whole world just disappears around him. I mean, the little brainlet sits in front of the door waiting for the Netflix delivery person. Because this is that old. Netflix used to deliver physical movies back then, and Scott is totally zoned out. All he thinks about is Ramona. But when he goes on a date with her and charms her in that special mouth-breathing way that was so popular at the time, she, weak in her knees, immediately invites home this special brain case for a hump and dump session. But Scott breaking the mold yet again, actually refuses to fuck her, because he knows there is something he needs to set right. He then spends quite some time agonizing over how to break up with Knives, trying to think of a way to do so that won't hurt her. Spoiler alert, and I speak from experience here, there ain't no such way, and trying to find one is only going to make the situation worse. But this is not done out of malice. He isn't doing this to hurt her, but rather misguided kindness. This was the kind of slight flaw that made a character more believable and lovable back in 2004 and dangerous to someone's career in 2023. And as for Scott's other monstrous acts, well, he mooches off his roommates and generally being a drain on the planet's dwindling resources. Certainly, this is not aspirational, but hardly wearing the skins of babies as a fashion statement levels of evil either. And yet, this was too much for the modern day. Which causes tremendous damage to the actual end product. As, again, one of the things that made Scott relatable, that made the series good and popular, was the reality that he was flawed. And yet, despite being flawed, could still fight the evil exes, and could still get the girl. That was aspirational. But not in 2023. Instead, the new Netflix anime focuses entirely on Scott as the villain, through a time travel plot I won't spoil, on the off chance that you would like to subject yourself to the show. But suffice to say, everything bad happens is Scott's fault, and a tiny bit Ramona's, but Ramona's great flaw is, get this, not loving herself enough. By the Lord above's brown hole, that is not Ramona's only or biggest flaw. If Scott is a villain, Ramona is Darth Vader with a Hitler mustache. The only reason any of the drama of the show happens is because of Ramona's countless and terrible relationship decisions. If Ramona Flower's mental space could be represented as a house, it would be one located in Iraq shortly after Operation America Fuck Yeah! And due to this, she builds the walls of Troy herself against Scott throughout the comic. Their dysfunctional relationship, and Scott continuously overcoming these obstacles and walls, is one of the good parts of the comics, and it's practically completely tossed in the bin for the Netflix adaptation, which as a result is, strangely enough, reduced to an aimless stumble, because, as it turns out, removing the main character and primary driving force from the show does it no favors. And since, mind-bogglingly, the show still focuses back in on Scott via Ramona's quest to save him, we don't even get to explore Ramona's side of the story. It is a lose-lose of current year proportions. For, despite all her flaws, Ramona could have been an interesting character to explore herself, just like Scott was an interesting character to explore because of his flaws. And yet, by wiping out the flaws of both, by killing Scott, and removing Ramona's difficult relationship history from the picture by having her go, oh, I actually really like that doofus guy I went out with once, and I'm gonna go to hell and back to save him, wipes out her conflict as well, because, well, now she's just like, oh, that brainlet was truly a charming little case of special needs, wasn't he? We've removed all of the actual conflict of the setting, all of the actual stakes, all of the actual overcoming of adversity, and replaced it with yet further dumbass pulled out of one's cavernous anus plot points. And with the author himself saying that he doesn't see any way to continue with the series, probably because he already realizes that he's walking across quite the tightrope as it is, Scott Pilgrim's legacy will be as nothing more than a warning to all other creators that even if you succeed in making a popular woke product, even by the low standards of woke toxicity of 2004, it is only a question of time until the demon you are dealing with comes for its pound of flesh. And for Scott Pilgrim, that was the end of the road. For the rest of us, a valuable reminder. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.